I've seen a lot of roads and a lot of people walking alongside them. But there was something about the image. This tiny woman in a thin coat, walking along the shoulder of a road in a February snowstorm in a small town in Ohio, carrying nothing but a plastic grocery bag. She moved slowly, carefully, like each step was a calculation. The snow was coming down hard, the kind that sticks to your face and makes you squint. And there she was, just walking into it like it was something she'd agreed to live with a long time ago. I got that image from one of the riders who was there that day. He sent it to me months later, said he couldn't stop thinking about what happened next, so I want to tell you about it. Because this is the thing about people, the thing about old people especially. You see them, and you think you understand their whole story. You think you know what their life looks like, but you don't. You just see the surface. You see the weathered face and the thin coat, and you assume poverty or poor choices or bad luck. But their life, the actual life they're living, that's something else entirely. Her name was Betty. She was 84 years old. For the last 6 weeks, she'd been walking 2.3 miles from her home to the hospital, where her husband of 61 years was lying in the ICU. 61 years. That's longer than most people stay alive. They were kids when they got married. Young and stupid and in love the way you are when you don't know yet that love is going to be the hardest thing you'll ever do. They'd had a life together, raised kids who'd moved away, built a home, survived together. And now, in his late 80s, her husband had gotten sick in a way that didn't have an ending yet. Just an ICU, just machines, just morphine, just his hand in hers. And every single day, Betty walked to see him. The bus had stopped running that route 2 years ago. Budget cuts, City said. Nobody used that line anymore, they said. So, the route got eliminated. But Betty used it. She'd walked that route to the grocery store before. She could walk it to the hospital. She couldn't afford a taxi. Couldn't ask her kids because they were dealing with their own lives. One of them lived in Arizona, the other in Seattle. They had grandkids and jobs and mortgages. She didn't want to be a burden. That's the thing about people her age. They were raised to be independent, and it's not something you unlearn. So she walked. In the rain, in the cold, in the early spring and the deep winter. Every morning before the sun got too high. Every evening back home as the light was fading. Every single day, because that's what you do when you've been married 61 years. You show up. People only see the leather when they look at bikers. They see the patches and the tattoos and the size, and they assume they know the story. They assume rebellion, or danger, or something that doesn't fit into regular society. But the thing about bikers, the thing I've learned over 30 years of riding, is that you can't judge a life by the surface, just like you can't judge an old woman walking in a snowstorm. The leather is just armor. It's what protects you from the world. But underneath, there's always something else. There were 8 of them riding through Ohio that February day. They weren't from there. They were headed to a rally in Michigan, scheduled to stop at a diner for gas and coffee, get back on the road. The kind of ride where you don't have time to stop, where the miles matter. The leader of the group, a man named Marcus who'd been riding for 40 years, was the kind of guy who paid attention. He noticed things. He noticed when something was wrong. And as they were riding through that small town, one of the younger guys saw her first. "Hey," he called back through the wind. "Slow up, what's that?" That was Betty, standing on the shoulder of the road in the snow, looking smaller than people usually look. Looking like she might blow away if someone didn't do something about it. Her coat was thin, the kind that had probably been respectable 10 years ago, but now it was threadbare at the cuffs, worn at the collar. You could see it from 50 yards away. You could see that it wasn't nearly enough. Marcus didn't hesitate. He raised his hand and the line of bikes slowed. One by one, they pulled to the shoulder, parking in a line on the gravel. 8 enormous motorcycles with 8 men in leather suddenly stopped around this tiny woman in a thin coat. She went rigid. You could see it from the way she held her body. Terror. Pure terror. This wasn't something that happened to people like her. Men like that didn't stop. And if they did, it usually wasn't for good reasons. The riders were dismounting now, taking off their gloves, moving with purpose. Betty's hands clutched that plastic grocery bag tighter. Her breath was coming short. Marcus walked toward her slowly. Didn't rush, gave her time to process. He was a big man, the kind of big that fills space, but he made himself smaller as he approached, crouched a little, made his voice gentle, lower than his normal register. "Hey," he said. Just that. Hey. Like they were people who might talk, like she wasn't something he'd found on the side of the road, but someone worth having a conversation with. "You okay?" Betty stared at him. Her eyes were sharp. You could see the intelligence there, the assessment. She couldn't have weighed more than 110 pounds. He was probably 250. His forearms were covered in tattoos, some old, some newer, all of them meaning something. His beard was gray and thick, kept neat with care. His cut was worn, the leather creased with age and use, the patches showing decades of riding. Everything about him said danger, but his eyes were kind. You could see her calculating that, trying to figure out if kindness could live in a package like that, whether it was safe to believe it. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was thin but steady, not apologetic, not desperate, just saying a fact. "Just heading to the hospital." "In a snowstorm?" She looked at him directly then. "It's the way I go." That's when Marcus understood. This wasn't something he needed to convince her about. This was her choice. This was her doing what she decided she had to do, and no weather was going to change it. He'd seen that kind of commitment before. You don't ride for 40 years without learning to recognize commitment. It looks the same whether it's a woman walking into a snowstorm or a man riding 20 hours straight because he said he would. It's the same thing underneath, the same refusal to quit. "Where's the hospital?" he asked. 2 miles, she said. "East. I've walked it before. I'll make it." Marcus noticed something in her voice, not resignation. Resignation sounds defeated. This was determination. She'd made up her mind. She'd do it, because doing it mattered more than not doing it. "How often you do this walk?" he asked. "Every day, morning and evening when I can." One of the other riders, a man in his late 50s, quiet guy, stepped forward. "Ma'am, you're in the middle of a snowstorm on foot." Betty looked at him. "I know where I am." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I believe you do." Marcus looked back at the other riders. They were moving in closer now, not threateningly, but like they were circling wagons. They already knew what he knew. This woman had to get to that hospital, and they were here, and nobody else was coming. So they'd have to be. "Get on a bike," Marcus said. Not a question, but not unkind either. Just what had to happen next? Betty hesitated. "I couldn't possibly—" "Ma'am," Marcus said, and there was something in his voice. Not anger, not impatience, just simple fact. "It's snowing. You're wearing a coat that won't keep you warm past the next quarter mile. There's 8 of us, and 1 of you. We're already stopped. We're already here. You're getting on a bike." There was nothing unkind in his voice. Just fact. Just what had to happen next. He wasn't asking her permission to be a good person. He wasn't explaining why she should let him help. He was just telling her what was going to happen because it was the only thing that made sense. Betty studied his face for a long moment. Then she nodded. A small gesture, but clear. "Yes, Okay, I understand what's happening here. Marcus put out his hand. She took it. Her skin was cold, the bones small and delicate, but her grip was firm. She wasn't fragile the way she looked. She was just old. There's a difference. He helped her onto his bike. She settled behind him carefully, still holding that plastic grocery bag. He turned back and draped his leather cut over her shoulders. It was enormous on her, swallowed her up. But it was warm. It smelled like oil and cold air and someone who'd lived a long time. "You hold on," Marcus said. "Just around my waist. Don't worry about hurting me." Betty nodded and placed her free hand on his jacket. He drove slowly to the hospital. Not the speed limit slow, but genuinely careful. He didn't lean into curves the way he normally would. He didn't accelerate to feel the bike respond under him. He just rode it like he was carrying something precious, which he was. The rest of the bikers followed behind, forming this strange convoy. A tiny elderly woman in a thin coat, wearing a leather cut, flanked by 7 motorcycles in a snowstorm. Traffic slowed as they passed. People stared. But Marcus didn't care. He had a job to do. When they got to the hospital, Marcus pulled into the circular drive and cut the engine. He steadied the bike as Betty dismounted. She moved carefully, her legs probably stiff from the ride, her old body not used to being on a motorcycle. Marcus helped her down, one hand steady on her elbow. "Thank you," Betty said, and she meant it, but she also wasn't gushing about it. She was just saying what was true. "You visiting someone?" Marcus asked. "My husband. He's in the ICU." "What's his condition?" Betty hesitated. And in that hesitation was the weight of everything. The 6 weeks of walking, the hospital visits, the machines keeping someone alive who maybe shouldn't be kept alive, the morphine, the conversations with doctors about quality of life and making decisions. "Not good," Betty said quietly. "They don't think he's going to. They're just making him comfortable now." Marcus understood. He'd been to enough deathbeds. His own father, 20 years ago. His mother, 10 years before that. He'd seen what that looks like. The acceptance, the grief that comes before the person's even gone. "How long you been doing this walk?" he asked. 6 weeks, Betty said. "Since he got admitted. The bus doesn't run this route anymore." "Every day? You walk it every single day?" "Yes." Marcus looked at the other riders. They were already dismounting. They were taking off their gloves. They were looking at Betty like she'd just become the most important person in their world. Because she had. Because what she was doing, showing up every single day for someone who was dying, that was the thing. That was the real thing. Not the leather, or the bikes, or the club patches. This was what everything was actually for. "What's your husband's name?" Marcus asked. Robert Phillips. He's been my husband for 61 years. Marcus nodded. "Robert Phillips. Okay. We're going to see Robert, all of us. And we're going to make sure you get to see him every day until this is over. What time do you usually come?" Betty looked confused. "Around 9 in the morning. I walk in the dark sometimes, but I like to be there before the morning shift changes." 9 in the morning, Marcus repeated. "One of us will be at your place at 8:30. Every morning. You're not walking anymore." "I couldn't ask you to do that. You didn't ask," Marcus said. He wasn't unkind about it, just clear. "We decided. That's different." They walked her to Robert's room. 8 leather-clad bikers in a hospital hallway, their tattoos visible, their patches showing decades of riding. The nurses at the station stared. The other visitors stared. Some of them moved aside. Some of them just watched, unsure what to make of it. But Marcus and the others, they just walked like they belonged there. Because in that moment, they did. They belonged there because this was what they were for. They were there to make sure an 84-year-old woman didn't have to walk alone. And they were there to see the man she'd been married to for 61 years and understand what that meant. Robert was sleeping. He looked smaller than Marcus expected, the kind of small that comes from getting old and then getting sick. His hands were on top of the covers. Betty moved to the chair next to his bed and sat down carefully. She reached out and took his hand. He didn't wake up. But something in her face changed. She was home. This was where she needed to be. The bikers stood around the room, quiet, respectful, not hovering, just present. The quiet man in his 50s stood by the window, looking out at the snow. A younger biker, maybe 45, solid blue eyes, the kind of guy who looked like he fixed things, stood by the door like he was keeping watch. The other 5 arranged themselves around the room, making themselves small, making room for Betty and Robert, even though Robert couldn't see them. Marcus stood at the foot of the bed. He looked at this old man who'd made a commitment to another person 61 years ago and kept it. He looked at his wife's face as she held his hand. He thought about the weight of that, the years, the bills, the kids, the jobs, the illnesses, the small victories, and the quiet heartbreaks. 61 years is a long time to be responsible for someone else's heart. After a few minutes, Marcus gestured to the others. They filed out quietly, all except Marcus. He stayed a few minutes longer. "I'm going to make sure he's taken care of," Marcus said to Betty, not promising anything he couldn't deliver, just stating what was going to happen. "Your husband, he's not going to be alone, and you're not going to be alone. You're not carrying this by yourself anymore. You understand?" Betty looked up at him. Her eyes were full, tears on the edge, but not falling. She nodded. She understood. She understood that something had changed, that the weight she'd been carrying by herself was about to be distributed among 8 people who'd showed up because they happened to be riding past. She cried, not in front of everyone, not yet. But when Marcus came back that night alone. Marcus came back that night. He drove his truck instead of his bike, found Betty's address from hospital records, an old 2-story house on a street where the houses were all 50 years old and the yards were small and neat. Snow had accumulated on the front steps. No one had shoveled them. He knocked on her door and she opened it still in her robe, confused to see a big man in a leather cut standing in the snow. Then she recognized him. "Marcus," she said, "please come in. Your coat—" "It's fine, ma'am," he said. "I came by to check on your furnace, make sure your heat's working." Betty hesitated. "That's kind of you, but I can't pay for—" "There's nothing to pay," Marcus said. "I just want to see if it's working." She let him in. The house was warm inside, heated by a space heater pushed against one wall, its element glowing. Marcus could see the cold spots in the far corners. The room had that particular feeling that cold has, even when something's warming it. That sense that the heat is a visitor, temporary, that the cold is home. "The furnace?" he asked. Betty pointed. "The basement. It's been broken for about 2 months. I've been using that space heater, and I kept the bedroom door closed mostly. Concentrated heat there at night." Of course, it had been broken. Of course, she'd been using a space heater instead of fixing what was broken. Because she couldn't afford the repair. Because you don't spend money on yourself when you're paying for hospital visits and medication and all the 1,000 things that cost money when someone's dying. Her kids probably didn't know. She probably wouldn't tell them because she wouldn't want them to worry. Marcus went down to the basement. The furnace was old, probably original to the house or close to it. The heating element was burned out. He could see it from across the room. He came back upstairs and made a phone call. "Jimmy?" he said. "Yeah, I'm at Betty's house. The furnace is shot. You think you and Thomas can come over?" He listened for a moment. "Yeah, tonight. I know it's late. We'll be quick." Within an hour, 2 other bikers showed up with tools in the back of a truck. One was the quiet mechanic type, probably 58, gray at the temples, moved like he knew exactly what needed doing. The other was younger, mid-40s, strong back, good with his hands, the kind of guy who made jokes while he worked. They didn't ask permission. They just went to work. The quiet one, Jimmy, pulled the furnace apart with practiced efficiency. "Elements burned out," he said, "but the rest of it's solid. Just needs a replacement part and we're back in business." "You got one?" Marcus asked. "In the truck. Been salvaging parts off old units. Should fit." Thomas, the younger one, was already getting tools organized. "Ma'am," he called up the basement stairs, "you got any coffee in that house? We're going to be here a couple hours." Betty appeared with a thermos and mugs. She'd made coffee. Of course she had. That was her generation. If people were working, you made them coffee. For 3 hours, the basement filled with the sound of tools and occasional cursing, and Jimmy explaining to Thomas why something had to be done a certain way. Marcus came in and out, checking on Betty, making sure she wasn't distressed by the noise and invasion of her home. But she seemed calm, almost relieved. The sound of work, the sound of something being fixed. When they were done, they tested the whole system. Heat poured out of the vents. Jimmy turned to Betty. "You're all set, ma'am," he said. "Keep her at 68 or so. She'll run fine. Let that space heater cool down, though. You're good now." "I can't pay you," Betty said. "I don't have—" "Ma'am, don't," Thomas said. It wasn't unkind, just direct. "We don't want your money. We want your furnace working. Now it does. That's the whole thing." They packed up their tools, didn't ask for anything, just left, saying they'd be back in the morning to pick her up for the hospital. And they were. The next morning, at 8:30, there was a knock on Betty's door. It was Thomas. He was in his work clothes, jeans and a heavy Carhartt jacket. "Morning, Mrs. Phillips," he said. "You ready to go see Robert?" That became the pattern. Every morning at 8:30, a different biker would show up at Betty's door. Sometimes it was Marcus in his truck, quiet and respectful. Sometimes it was Jimmy, the quiet mechanic, who never said much, but always brought coffee from the diner and remembered exactly how Betty had taken it the day before. A splash of cream, 1 sugar. Sometimes it was Thomas, who'd crack jokes and tell stories about his grandkids and make Betty laugh for the first time in years. Real laugh. Not the kind you do because you're supposed to, but the kind that comes from somewhere genuine inside you. One morning, it was a woman biker. Had to be in her early 60s, gray-haired, tough-looking, the kind of woman who'd lived a life and wasn't apologizing for any of it. Her name was Diana. She pulled up on her own bike, a Harley that was as worn and cared for as any of the men's bikes. She came in without asking, hung her leather cut on the rack, and sat down across from Betty at the kitchen table. "Hi, Betty," she said. "I'm Diana. I ride with the club. I wanted to come see you." "Would you like coffee?" Betty asked, doing what she knew how to do. "I'd like to talk to you," Diana said. "But yeah, coffee's good too." For an hour, they sat and talked. Diana asked about Robert, asked about their life together, asked about what it was like to have been married that long, asked what Betty missed, asked what scared her. She didn't try to fix anything. She just asked. Like an 84-year-old woman's life and heart mattered. When they were leaving for the hospital, Diana put her arm around Betty's shoulders. "You're not alone," she said. "You need to know that. You're not alone in this anymore." Betty's eyes filled, but she nodded. She understood. Every evening, someone else would pick Betty up from the hospital and drive her home. Sometimes it was Marcus with his truck, and sometimes he'd come in and sit at her kitchen table for a while. Sometimes it was Jimmy, who'd check the furnace while he was there, making sure it was still running right. Sometimes it was one of the other riders, men whose names Betty was learning, whose stories she was beginning to understand. They'd make sure she'd eaten. If she hadn't, they'd make her something, nothing fancy, just whatever was in the house. They'd put groceries in her fridge. They'd fix things that were broken. They'd sit with her. They'd listen. Some of them talked about their own families, their own losses. Some of them just sat in quiet with her, knowing that sometimes quiet is the only honest thing. After the first week, Marcus organized it more formally. He had 35 members of the club, a mix of ages and backgrounds, all of them with the same basic code. You don't leave people behind. He printed out a schedule on his kitchen table and distributed it. Different people assigned to different days. Morning shifts to pick Betty up. Evening shifts to bring her home. Some people were assigned to grocery runs. Some were on house maintenance, which is what they called it when they came over to fix things that were broken or failing or falling apart. The other bikers in the club heard about what was happening, and they started showing up too. Word spread. Betty's story became the club's story, and the club's story became about what they were actually for. Not the rebellious thing, not the outlaw mythology. This was the real thing. This was the code underneath the leather. This was what you rode for. It spread to the hospital staff too. The nurses started recognizing the bikers. They started asking their names. They started understanding that this wasn't a criminal situation, but a merciful one. One nurse told a regular customer at the diner about this elderly woman who came in every day to see her dying husband and the bikers who'd taken it upon themselves to get her there. The customer knew someone. The someone knew someone. And eventually, it started to spread. People started noticing, started being moved by it, started understanding that rough men in leather can have the gentlest hearts if you actually see them. Robert's condition got worse over 2 weeks. The doctors adjusted the medications. They talked to Betty about increasing the morphine, about comfort care, about what the end would probably look like. On one of those afternoons, Marcus sat with Betty in the hospital hallway. Neither of them said much. They just sat. After a while, Marcus said, "He's lucky. Your husband. A lot of people don't get someone who shows up every day. A lot of people die alone." Betty nodded. "I made him a promise," she said. 61 years ago. I made him a promise that I'd be there." "You kept it," Marcus said. "I'm not done yet," Betty said. "I won't be done until he doesn't need me anymore." Marcus understood. The grief doesn't end when the person dies. It just changes shape. But the love, the showing up, the witness, the presence, that has to continue until the very end. That's what commitment means. That's what 61 years means. 2.5 weeks after that February snowstorm, Robert died. It was quiet. Betty was there. His hand was in hers. She'd been holding it most of the day, talking to him about their life, about the garden they planted together, about the time they drove to the Grand Canyon and got lost and ended up in the most beautiful place they'd ever seen. She was remembering him. She was honoring him. She was saying goodbye in the way that only someone who's been married 61 years knows how to do. When the machine stopped and his heart stopped and the room got quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when someone dies, Betty didn't make a sound. She just held his hand until it was cold. Then she let go. The ICU nurse called Marcus. She called everyone on the list. Within an hour, there were bikers at the hospital. They came to the room. They stood with Betty. They cried quietly. Men who'd never known Robert but understood what they'd just lost. They understood that their club was smaller now, even though they'd never officially counted Robert as a member. He was part of them now. He was part of their story. The bikers came to the funeral. All of them. 35 leather-clad men and women in a small church, every pew in the back filled with them. They didn't wear their colors, that's not appropriate in a church, but you could see the outline where the patches had been on their jackets. You could see the marks on their skin where tattoos disappeared under collar and cuff. You could see what they were, and you could see that they were grieving. The pastor didn't know what to make of them at first. He'd lived in this town his whole life. He knew bikers meant trouble. He was ready to be defensive. But when he watched them grieve, when he saw how they stood close to Betty, when he heard them talk about Robert, a man they'd never met, with the kind of respect that only comes from understanding what it means to love someone for 61 years, he understood. After Robert was buried, the bikers didn't disappear. That's the thing about these stories that needs to be said. The help didn't end when the crisis ended. The helping stopped being about Robert and started being about Betty, because they understood that grief doesn't end when the funeral does. It just changes. It becomes something you carry, and you carry it better if you don't have to do it alone. Marcus started coming by on Sundays. He'd bring groceries. He'd sit in Robert's chair, which Betty kept, pulled up to the window where Robert had liked to sit and look out at his garden. They'd talk. Sometimes it was about Robert, sometimes about the life they'd had together, sometimes about Betty's kids and grandkids who'd called after the funeral, shocked and grateful to learn that their mother had been taken care of while they were living their distant lives. Sometimes they just sat quiet, which is the most honest thing two people can do together after a grief like that. One of the younger bikers, a guy named Paul, started showing up on Wednesdays. He was good with his hands. Her front step needed repair. Betty had been putting it off, afraid to fall. Paul fixed it. He replaced the wood, painted it, made sure it was safe. Her gutters were clogged with leaves. Paul cleaned them. Her bathroom sink was leaking. Paul fixed it, and while he worked, he explained what he was doing, so Betty understood how to spot problems in the future. He wasn't just fixing things for her. He was teaching her. He was building her capacity to live alone. He was giving her tools and knowledge so that she wouldn't have to ask for help next time. Diana, the woman biker, started coming on Friday afternoons. They'd go to the grocery store together. They'd sit at the diner. They'd talk about being women who'd lived long lives and learned things and weren't done yet. Betty laughed. She laughed a lot. Not fake laugh. Real laugh that came from somewhere deep inside her where there was still joy even after 61 years, and grief and age. One Friday, Diana brought her granddaughter, who was 6, with her. The little girl was shy. But Betty, who'd been teaching her whole life before she'd had to walk to the hospital every day, knew what to do. She let the girl sit next to her and help her shell peas. She told her stories. She let her be useful. By the end of the afternoon, the girl was laughing and planning to come back. I've seen a lot of roads and a lot of people along those roads, but this one stayed with me. I kept thinking about what would have happened if those 8 bikers hadn't been riding through that town that day. If they hadn't noticed a tiny woman in a thin coat walking into a snowstorm. If they'd minded their own business, like we're all supposed to do in a culture that tells you strangers aren't your responsibility. Betty would have made the walk. She'd have made it every day for however long Robert lasted. She'd have visited him alone. She'd have grieved alone. She'd have come home to a broken furnace and not fixed it because she couldn't afford it. She'd have been alone through one of the hardest things a person can go through. She'd have had to figure out how to live by herself in a house full of 61 years of memories. She'd have been diminished. That was the path laid out. That was the road she was on. But 8 rough men on motorcycles stopped, and then 35 more. And they decided that wasn't how her story was going to end. People ask me sometimes what the club is actually for. What's the point of the patches and the colors and the brotherhood? And I tell them this story. I tell them it's for seeing. It's for noticing. It's for understanding that the code, the actual code, not the mythology, is just one thing. You don't leave people behind. You see someone in trouble and you stop. You don't look away. You don't tell yourself it's not your problem. You see an 84-year-old woman walking into a snowstorm and you see that she shouldn't have to do that alone. And then you fix it. When I told Marcus this story, told him I wanted to write it down, he got uncomfortable. "Don't make us into something we're not," he said. "What are you?" I asked. "We're just people who ride," he said. "We're people who noticed, that's all." But that's not all. That's everything. Because noticing is the rarest thing. Noticing and then acting. And then staying. And then not taking credit for it. Betty's still alive. She's 85 now, in her mid-80s, living in the same house where she raised her family and buried her husband. She's got friends who stop by. She's got people who care about her. Diana, the woman who came on Friday afternoons, they're like sisters now. They go to the diner every Friday like clockwork. They sit in the same booth. They order the same thing. They talk about things that matter. That's a friendship. That's real. Paul brings his kids over sometimes. Betty's teaching his 9-year-old how to bake. She taught him to make his grandmother's recipe for cinnamon rolls, and now he makes them for his dad on Father's Day. His 7-year-old comes over and they work in her garden. Betty teaches her the names of the plants, what they need, how to know when something's sick, and what to do to help it. She's teaching him how to care for living things. Marcus comes by Sundays. Sometimes he brings Diana. Sometimes he brings other bikers. Sometimes he comes alone. He sits in Robert's chair and they drink coffee and watch the world go by. That's the thing about real help. It doesn't end. It just becomes part of the rhythm of life. Marcus told me something once. He said the road teaches you one thing if you ride long enough. It teaches you that you don't leave people behind. You see it out there. Someone broken down on the shoulder with their bike in pieces, and you pull over. Someone in the rain without gear, you find them shelter. Someone carrying more than they should, you lighten the load. The road teaches you that strangers are your responsibility. That's the actual code. Not the leather or the noise or the rebellion. That. Betty had Robert for 61 years, and for 6 weeks she walked alone. But when it mattered most, when she couldn't do it anymore, she didn't have to. 8 men in leather who she'd never met decided that's not how her story was going to end. They decided she mattered. They decided that an 84-year-old woman walking in a snowstorm was worth stopping for. And that changed everything.